Wednesday Garden Report. First of two off days for the Celtics here. So get back into some podcasting, some longer conversation about the team here. Off their 14-4 now start. And the epic win last night over the Bulls in the in-season tournament to make it to Indiana and hopefully Vegas after that. Brian Barrett's here from the Ringer. I saw you this morning, Brian, and last night, of course, as well. Just as excited as me about this thing. And I felt some shame over it for a little while in the early stages, just because everybody's shrugging their shoulders. No one can figure it out. Everyone's saying it's the dumbest thing ever. And then it felt like last night was the game that changed everything. And the approval rating, just reading tweets, articles, listening to people, just shot through the roof off this game that was the perfect encapsulation of what this thing's supposed to be. Taking this game that would have been one of the most forgettable of the year and turning it into something memorable, something unique. I really was sitting there at the Garden last night, blown away by what I was watching, because we've never seen anything like this, a 20-point game where this team still has its foot to the pedal. And the layer on top of that is that it was a surprise. And there's few things that really stun you in sports, but when the coach comes out before the game and says, "We're not going for this effectively," and you're like, "Oh," and then in the fourth quarter, you see the starters lining up on the sideline, and all of a sudden they're out there flying around again, clearly going for this. It was like, "Whoa, this this is awesome," and I loved every minute of it. What were you thinking last night?
Yeah, what was the word that Joe used after the game? He kept saying, like, this is the process. We trusted the
Yeah, the
process, and,
process.
and then that happened. It's like, yeah, you weren't going for it, but then in the fourth quarter, you're following rather Andre Drummond, Hacker Drummond taking part later on in the game. I thought it was awesome. And I was saying last night on my podcast, I can't remember a more memorable regular season ending, or regular season night. Like, you can go back to Kobe retiring, and I believe that same night, Golden State set the record for the 73 wins. So we've
Yeah, they're
had
going
like
at the
those,
same time.
yeah. So we've had like those kind of moments. One year, Denver and Minnesota were playing for like the final playoff spot, but this was like nothing we've ever experienced before. And I thought on Friday when the Celtics were playing the Magic and they were losing, and the Magic were still going hard late in that game, even though they had it sealed up, I was thinking to myself, oh, this is for the in-season tournament. This may get crazy on Tuesday. And then later on in the day, I was watching Phoenix versus Memphis, and Phoenix was doing the same thing. They were trying to run up the score on the Grizzlies. So I thought to myself, Tuesday is going to be awesome. And it really was. And the Bulls for the Celtics, I mean, that was the perfect opponent to play, where they just kept going at it. But the reality is, hey, man, the players clearly care about this, to the fact, and the coach clearly cares about this, to the fact that they're following Andre Drummond late in the game. Now, the one concern long term would just be like, if a star player gets injured, like when Jalen like almost went down there for a second, I'm like, oh boy, this is not going to
Yeah,
be good if
Joe
Jalen
mentioned
Brown's
that
actually hurt.
was what made him take everybody out.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So that, well, I actually at the time I'm like, put them all back in because you're going to lose the lead and
It
lose
was
like the point
close. Yeah.
differential. But I had a ton of fun. I thought it was awesome. I think this is a huge hit for the NBA, because this would have just been a normal night in the NBA, and Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown, Derek White, and Drew Holiday would have been sitting on the bench for the entire fourth quarter. But instead, this is intriguing. Like right after the Celtics wrapped up, I'm watching the Nets and the Raptors, and Royce O'Neal hits a big three, and I'm fired up. So now that this thing is actually happening, I want the Celtics to win it. Why wouldn't you? I mean, clearly the players care. Like LeBron's going hard at this thing. Devin Booker's going hard at this thing. We see the Bucks going hard at this thing. So I'm all in. I think it's awesome. I think there's tweaks you could make, but I'm certainly happy for year one so far.
Yeah, and the point differential is obviously going to be the thing that everyone debates, and all the players were talking about last night. And I think a lot of that was just a little bit of public posturing. Like, I don't think they felt too bad about running it up, because you had to do it. You had no choice. It was the way this thing worked, and they looked pretty excited about doing it out there. And you just didn't want to, shit on your opponents publicly after the game, and gloat about beating them by 30. I think they wanted to manage, especially Joe. He was in the hallway looking for Andre Drummond. He was in the hallway talking with Billy Donovan after. So I think that was just a little bit of PR on their part to kind of, you know, manage those relationships that they have on the other side, because they were pretty clearly into this. And there was a case to sit back, and I'm sure some teams did, even though, as you mentioned, there's some notable teams that made this thing. We can get a bunch of days off early next week, play a couple crap teams and take those wins and just skip this travel. But whether it was Vegas, whether it was the money, or whether it's just intrigue about being involved in this thing, which I'm sure was part of it too, everybody eventually got on board because, you go back to when this first started rolling out, it was just complaints, confusion, the floors looking weird, the jerseys looking weird, and nobody understanding what this thing was all about. And for the league's part, it was rolled out kind of clunkily. So there's some responsibility on their part for that. But it felt like everybody just started to get more comfortable going for this as each game passed. And fortunately for the Celtics, they did have a manageable group here. They were able to slip up against the Magic. And in a weird twist, I know Bill tweeted about this. The Magic aren't playing on that last day. So you knew what point total you needed to pass them and everything you needed to do, and you were able to go for it. Well, they just had to sit back and hope that the Celtics didn't do that. And, after beating the Celtics pretty handily there, they don't make this thing at all. So I think the obvious adjustment, if we're going to kick some around here, is to just play more games in this last year. I mean, you had 5 teams pretty much with the same record between the Heat, Cavs, and a couple other teams there who didn't make this thing. Nets, of course, went 3-1 as well. Magic, very deserving to be in this, but aren't. And as we mentioned, the days just not lining up. Like if you played each team in your group twice, I don't think the point differential would be as big of a deal. You really wouldn't have these things on the last day where you run up the score. Maybe in a few cases you would, and it would still be fun. And you'd have a better sample of who actually played the best out of the group rather than just an injury on this night deciding who wins the group.
Yeah, I would say too, like from the Bulls' perspective or the Magic's perspective, don't rip the Bulls off so bad in a trade, and maybe they would have put up more of a competitive fight. Like, don't give up those draft picks for Nick Vucevic, who was just a traffic cone at this particular point in time. That was a terrible trade when they made it, and it looks even worse right now, considering the fact that you wouldn't even, and I know he's injured right now, you wouldn't trade Wendell Carter for Vucevic right now if the contracts matched, right? Like Wendell Carter is a more valuable NBA player. So that's the first part of it. And in terms of the point differential, I agree with you that maybe one more game or something along those lines. Like my boss, Bill Simmons, tweeted out that essentially he would be down to do, instead of the 6 groups, go to 5 groups and make it basically all regional. So essentially
Yeah.
what you would have is the Celtics, Knicks, Nets, 76ers, Wizards, Raptors in one group, Bucks, Bulls, Pacers, Pistons, Cavs, Wolves, Heat, Magic, Hornets, Hawks, Pelicans, Grizzlies in another. Then you would have the Spurs, Rockets, Mavs, Thunders, Nuggets, and Suns, and then the Lakers, Clippers, Warriors, Kings, Jazz, Portland. So then in that particular case, you would have 5 group winners and 3 wild card teams. Plus, you would play an extra game during the group round. So maybe the point differential wasn't as obvious as it was in some of these situations. And obviously, the Celtics one was the most egregious one. I would also just look at it like that's a regular season game too for the Bulls. Like they just didn't show up, and like Zach LaVine was the main piece of that. Where I don't know why anybody would want to trade for that guy at this particular point. So
And he
I
got
feel like
hurt.
that, yeah, I feel like that game kind of exaggerated everything. But in terms of from where this thing started, like the courts, obviously that's an issue if Jaylen Brown was slipping on the court and you saw other players slipping on the court. The fact that Grant Williams was shooting warm-ups and the three-point line was too far away, that's an issue. But going from the first day, and I guess the Jaylen thing's not the first day, to where it is now, I mean, it's pretty crazy to think about. Everybody was killing this thing for the first couple of days of it, and now everybody's pumped up about it. So I think it's kind of cool that it went from this thing stinks to, oh, this thing's awesome, and now everybody wants to go to Vegas.
Yeah. And when I was tweeting about it at the start, everyone's like, who cares? And then yesterday, everyone's tweeting me saying, how'd they get in? And I do think that's probably one of the biggest things that they're going to have to fix. And we talked about for a second before we started here. There need to be some better explaining or explanations, more clear explanations about the scenarios. And when it came down to points, I know Hollinger was tweeting about how the matchups were actually going to come out. And I felt like I had a pretty good handle on this. But once the Celtics actually won the game, I had no clue where they were going. I couldn't figure it out on the fly. It was like Indiana was 4-0, and then the Bucks won and passed them, I guess. So they end up playing the Knicks, and then the Celtics end up with Indiana there. So even me, who was pretty locked in on this thing right through last night, trying to read all the different scenarios, ended up pretty confused in the end about what the matchups were going to be here, just based off how the results went out there. And it was all dependent on how many points the Heat won by there. So that's the real downside, I'd say, to the point differential. Fans love the fourth quarter last night across the board, I think. And if the players weren't comfortable with it, so be it. I don't think that's as big of a deal. There just has to be, I think, more understanding and clarity among fans what's going on out there. Because even though they put the score up on the board, that the Nets were up by 2, I don't think anyone in the building really understood what that meant or how much they need to win by. Because on the other hand, the Celtics had to win by 23, but the Nets had to win, but not win by too much.
Right.
So if they ran it up a little bit last night, and they did late, I think they got up to like 15 in the late minutes of that game, the Nets would have been in over the Celtics, and then everybody's head would have been spinning. So it's confusing. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I think one thing they can do is, and I know apparently the NBA app had a thing, crunch time or whatever. I don't understand why you don't just put like basically the red zone on NBA TV. I guess that's what crunch time was. I'm not the biggest fan of the NBA app. I feel like it never works for me. It only lets me stream things, my league pass on one computer instead of doing it on my. It's a whole thing for me. So I'm not the biggest NBA app guy. I would just hire Scott Hansen for a night. I'm sure he'd do it, right? And have him do it like he does the red zone
That would
every
be so
Sunday. Like
funny.
who would be better than that? And I also think like all the broadcasts and Mike Gorman and Scal did a good job kind of like keep going. And they were going back, they were showing graphics of like the other games, but they should just have the other scoreboards. And then later on, I'm watching Golden State and Sacramento, and it was essentially like now Sacramento just ended up winning the game. Golden State choked it away, but Golden State had to win by 12. Sacramento, if they lost by 11 or less, they would have been in. So they should have had just a different scoreboard next to that one with like the aggregate score of what the margin had to have been. And I felt like there should have been, I know you were tweeting out a lot during the game, like the differential and updating it. There should have just been a site. And if there was one, I didn't see it. That was just solely the point differential where it's just flipping up and down so people could actually sort of monitor that thing. But to the individual part of it from a Celtics aspect here, when Joe had to talk to Billy Donovan. I know Donovan, the only thing he was really pissed about was the Andre Drummond
The
thing.
free throws,
But
yeah.
like, I totally understand why the Celtics did it. They thought it was an advantage. Clearly, it was because he was missing free throws left and right. But the other thing is, you can't really warn the other team about that until it's happening, right? Because what is Joe supposed to do? Hey, Billy, I know it's a tough season for you guys. If we get up by like 20 in the third or the fourth quarter, we're gonna keep going for it. Like you're gonna tell your opponent that before the game. So there, like if you're the opposition, you kind of have to know what's at stake here. Like we saw what was going on at the start of it Friday. If you're the Bulls, you have to expect this is going to happen. Not to mention the Bull. How many games they play? 4. The Bulls had a controversial thing in 2 of them. They were already mad about the Raptors situation when they played Toronto. Like that Toronto was having their guys in late. What did you think was going to happen this time? You didn't think that the Celtics are going to do the same thing. So I mean, they just be better than doing all this complaining if you're them.
Well, that was the funniest part, and the question did come up in Billy's pregame about the expectation that the Celtics were going to try to run this up. But that's how bad the Bulls are. How like if they were playing the Heat or something yesterday or the Bucks, no one would have been in the visitors pregame saying, "You ready for the Celtics to try to push this to 30?" But it was so obvious that the Celtics were going to be able to do that because the Bulls are horrible, and this just did come down to them getting blown away here as they have for most of the season. And I think part of their reaction is that they're mad and frustrated at themselves for the start, as they are the Celtics for doing whatever they did last night. And Drummond, we tried to get him last night. He didn't want to talk about it. And the one thing that was interesting that he said to us was, "I'll answer questions about basketball. I'm not talking about the free throws. I just want to talk about basketball." And that is kind of the mindset that a lot of players have about this, it seems, is that this whole thing here is some extraneous fake gimmick that's being placed upon the game here. And it's a little frustrating to hear Jalen say it too. Like Drew, whatever, veteran, professional, doesn't want to he knows a lot of guys on the other side, I'm sure, them the wrong way. Jalen was in this process of creating it, coming up with rules, figuring out how this thing was going to work. And I know the NBA was pushing this more than the players were. But you had to say at a certain point, and he more than anyone should have understood the implications of that. And I hate hearing him say last night that maybe you just get rid of this because it was awesome. And
Yeah.
like whatever discomfort they felt should have been cleared up, should have been easy to move past just because of how clear the implications were going into the game. I mean, it's one thing for fans to be confused. If you're a coach or a player going into this, you should have a pretty good understanding of what the scenarios are and what you're playing for going into it. Because even if you think it's fake, even if you think it's bogus, it's part of the schedule now. It's part of the league. It's part of this tournament. So if you want to be in it, you have to embrace it.
Yeah, and I think in defense of the league and the players who helped put this whole thing together, nobody knew the point differential was going to be this big of a thing when they actually
Yeah,
made it, right? Like
right.
a lot of people thought the Celtics were just going to go 4-0 in the group. Like the Magic have been one of the biggest surprises in the NBA. Like everybody knew they had a nice young core, but do people think to start the season, what we're 18 games in for the Celtics, that they would be the second best team from a record
Well,
perspective
that's
in
the
the
other
Eastern
hand of
Conference?
this, right? You go and get blown out by the Magic by 22 points or whatever, 17 to go up to 22. That forces you to drop the 30 points on Chicago because you were letting the score run up on the Orlando side the other night. So it's all connected.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're exactly right on that. So, and so I don't, I feel like, all right, it may be the point. Like, I'm sure it was uncomfortable for certain guys on the team where, like, Drew Holiday's buddies with DeMar DeRozan, and he's out there late in the fourth quarter and they're trying to get it to like 30 points or whatever. Like, I'm sure that does feel uncomfortable from in some angle. But in some ways, like, that's not your competition. The Bulls aren't. Your competition is try to make it to the in season tournament, try to advance. So it is competition for the Celtics. Like, they didn't take their foot off the gas whatsoever. And for a team that at times has played around with its food late in games, we've seen this for the past couple of years. And another thing they've struggled with is the third quarter. They came into that game last night 29th in the NBA in offensive rating in the third quarter. This is the Boston Celtics, one of the best teams in the NBA. Like, how is that possible? And their offense was not spectacular in the third. It was spectacular in every other quarter. But they won the quarter 28-18, which for me, that's an accomplishment for the Celtics, considering for some
Yeah.
reason they've been so bad in the third quarter. So I thought it forced them to keep their sort of their foot on the gas pedal, which is something that they, let's face it, they've struggled with. Another thing they've done throughout this tenure over the past 2 years with Joe Mazzulla is they love walking the dog in the fourth quarter and slowing down the pace, playing slower than they ordinarily would. And in this game, they couldn't. So I thought it got outside of their comfort zone. So I enjoyed every minute of it. I'm really fired up for Tuesday. Now, I was saying this last night. Think about this. The Celtics play the 76ers on Friday, which is obviously a huge game. Most people believe that the 76ers right now, based on the way Milwaukee's playing, the fact that they can't cover anybody, that Philadelphia is the second best team and they have in the East and they have a chance to make a move. Even if maybe people say, hey, eventually Lillard and Giannis figures it out. The team that I saw the night before Thanksgiving, that team is not competing with the Celtics in a 7-game series. Like, and I know, oh, they're going to get Jay Crowder back. Okay, great. Like, what are you going to put him on Jason Tatum? Like, come on. I mean, maybe like
Yeah.
6 years ago when Jason Tatum was still at Duke, Jay Crowder could cover Jason Tatum. Not at this point in time. So I should be more fired up for that Philly game, especially considering those two teams have a little bit of rivalry. But I'm more fired up for Monday, where they
Yeah.
go and they play in Indiana against Halliburton, one of the up and coming stars in the NBA. He was saying, I can't remember who said it, might have been Tim Bontemps, where Halliburton's never played on TNT. Like, he's finally going to play on TNT for the first time. Indiana, we know this, and I know they haven't played relevant basketball in a while. I mean, I think their last playoff series was with the Kyrie Celtics, where they swept them. I was
They
at
were
one
in
of
the
those games.
bubble.
Oh, they were in the bubble. Okay, so they
Yeah.
were in the bubble too. But they have. But my point being, they haven't played a lot of relevant games. They're going to have a crazy crowd. Like Indiana, we all know it's a great basketball state. Like even
Right.
going, and I know going back to Reggie Miller, but when it was the Paul George Pacers with Hibbert in that group, David West, that and George Hill, like those teams had awesome crowds against the Miami Heat. Like I think that's going to be awesome. And for me to be more excited about a team that is second to last in the NBA in defensive rating than playing a rival of yours in the Philadelphia 76ers on a Friday night, that tells you that this tournament is a success.
Yeah, that was what I was most curious about coming into it. What kind of teams would make this? Would it be the best teams, period? Celtics, Nuggets. Denver obviously doesn't make it. Injury is a big part of that. But you do end up with the Lakers, Suns, Celtics here, Kings, top end West team, and a mix of some of those up and coming teams like Indiana, Magic were right on the edge of it. New Orleans is still kind of in that mold too. So it's a good mix of teams here. It's a competitive a group of teams, some contenders, some up and comers who might surprise people and go on a run here. So I'm excited about that. And to go back to your Missoula points, I thought it was his finest night as this team's coach, just in terms of how he managed it, how he explained himself after. I thought it was one of his most interesting pressers. he did a great job managing this, and as you said, grouping in the things that they needed to play better at, rebounding and, pace and all those different things offensively, moving the ball. I mean, they had been ranked among the lowest, passing teams in the NBA, and then they come out with
Yeah.
36 assists in this game. So I loved how they were able to fold in focusing on themselves and improving some things that had slipped over the last 5, 6 games coming into this with getting this score and, reaching the tournament. And he explained it so well that I wasn't going to have them focusing on the number here, chasing that number. I was going to have them focus on playing well and getting there naturally. And I thought that was just a really good coaching move. And it's not just him saying it. We saw it play out on the court. Like, it worked. The mindset, the approach that he was instilling on the team going into this. And I think that more than anything, for all the doubts there's been about Joe here over the last year and change, shows that he does have the pulse of this team. Like, I think he does have a good handle on this locker room, on these guys, getting them to play the right way and emphasizing the right things. Like, I always am curious about how he, like, we talk about the numbers here. He's a very analytical guy. He's talking about a lot of numbers and margins and stuff like that. That can be tough, I think, to, disseminate to a team or at least emphasize day in and day out. But he has them staying attuned to that stuff well. Like, they're a great rebounding team despite being smaller. They usually take care of the ball well, though that slipped in recent weeks. And they do end up generating those 3-point totals that he wants in, productive ways. So I've been impressed by Joe so far this year, despite a few slip ups, despite some of the losses that were frustrating at different points and the everlasting timeout debate. He's made me more confident in him to start this year.
Yeah, I'm with you. It does feel like he's more comfortable too. And I have some empathy for the role that he was put into last year. Here's a team that just went to the NBA Finals. They loved their coach. The coach is in a huge controversy. You're in the second row, and there's guys on the staff that could have easily thought, hey, whether it's Ben Sullivan, Damon Stoudemire, I deserve the job over Joe. So then you got to rally those troops and you got to rally the team. And at the time, some of the players were still upset. Even like, remember when Ime was rumored to go to the Nets? Like, that became another talking point with the Celtics players where they wanted
Yeah.
Ime back in the league. So that whole situation. So, and I do think it's huge who he surrounded himself with, right? Like, now it's his guys, and his guys are actually elite assistant coaches. When we're talking about Sam Cassell, all you got to do is watch Jason Tatum, all the work that he's doing in the post. And we
Yeah.
know that Charles Lee has been a final this past season. This past offseason, he was a finalist for a bunch of head coaching jobs. Like, he's probably going to get a job in the next cycle. And it works out perfectly that, oh, here comes Drew Holiday, who he coached for all these years, and he like was his
Yeah.
personal like position coach, if you will. So I think he's definitely more comfortable. The one thing that still concerns me about the Celtics offensively, now their post ups are way up. Tatum is up to 3.1 a game, which is 10th in the NBA. He's uber efficient. Porzingis is super efficient in the post, but they still they take the most threes in the NBA in terms of the frequency, but they don't get to the free throw line. They don't score at the basket. So all those things do concern me a little bit in terms of, all right, like, they have all this talent and they can do it so many different ways. I do wonder, like, in their drives, they're second last in the NBA in drives per game. And Tatum, from a drive perspective, is one of the most efficient players in the league as well. So I do wonder at times if they do get a little bit too 3-point reliant. And I feel like this is a conversation now that we've had for a year and a half, but it did rear its head in the postseason, right? Where the Heat were like a bad defensive team against 2-point shooting last year, and the Celtics just kept chucking threes.
Yeah. And you go back to the decision making of those two stars. The playmaking numbers aren't great with either of them to start this year. The turnovers are high with Jalen. They're creeping up with Jason too. I feel like it's been a handful of games right now where he's had 4 or 5
Some bad
turnovers.
ones last night.
Yeah, so that's always going to be a conversation with them. Fortunately, you have those 3 release valves for them in Porzingis, who you can basically just throw to and get a basket out of, or Holiday and White, who you can rely on as playmakers. And I thought they did a great job of that in this game, letting them find Jalen cutting. Horford, too. A real nice
Yeah.
infusion of playmaking from him in this one, too. So you have other guys that you can rely on to make the plays for them. And I do feel like sometimes they get away from that a little bit. I mean, White had an 11 assist game recently, and he never turns the ball over. So there are guys that they can lean on to do that thing that the two stars are weakest at, and a big man that they can throw to and score at a, well over 50% clip inside the arc in Porzingis now. So they have all those things at their disposal. Just comes down to decision making with this group still. I mean, they've stacked talent on talent on talent going back really 3 years since that awful 2021 team. And the same issues exist. And it goes back to those guys. And I know a lot was made out of Brown after the Charlotte game, and rightfully so. But it's Tatum too. Like, the pace goes back to him a lot of the time, walking the ball up. The driving, as you mentioned there, that's got to be him setting that tone. The pick and roll numbers really haven't been good for Tatum either to start this year. I think worse than Brown's, at least last time I looked at it. So you still have a playmaking offensive issue with this team, and it goes beyond just the amount of threes they take or the shot distribution. It's really about decision making. And fortunately, the one thing that does make me feel a little bit at ease, Brian, is that they've been great in the clutch. And that shows the impact of the new players they have and their ability to lean on those guys in those situations. You just wonder, of course, with Porzingis down, is he going to be able to sustain, through this whole run here? Because I love what Horford gives them here, but it's what Porzingis gives this offense that really makes it a different kind of team than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I love reserve Al because the minutes are down almost 5 per game. So this is the whole thing. Remember last year, his shooting completely dipped off in the postseason. Get that guy to the finish line healthy, because we've already seen in these big games, he was awesome on Embiid. I go back to, this guy's already defended the second most isolation possessions in the NBA, and he's 37. We saw it at the end of the Hawks game. He blocked Trae Young. He got switched on to Trae Young, and he
He's
blocked
still
Trae
so
Young.
good at that. That's my favorite
Yeah.
part of his game, switching on to the guards.
So you still have that, and then the other thing I would say in terms of like that he's been great for this team lately. I really think that it was a big adjustment going from, this guy has a chance, and he's probably going into the Hall of Fame, right? Because it's the Basketball Hall of Fame. He's a 2-time national champion. He's been an All NBA guy. Like, if they eventually win a championship, he's going to get into the Hall of Fame. He's been a really good player he's 37 years old, right? So I think he's got a really good shot at the Hall of Fame. But I mean, that's a digression here. But late in these games, I think the one thing that I would point to in terms of the overall thing that I'd like to see more, just in general, more Derek White. Derek
Yeah.
White, there was a point in the second quarter where he made like 5 straight plays that should have resulted in baskets. And one of them was just like Hauser missed an open three. That's going to happen every once in a while.
The
But to your
second
point about,
quarter against the Hawks, he takes over.
yeah, he did this last year too when Tatum was dealing with the ankle situation in game 7, and he just took over that game in the third quarter. And I just feel like when I feel like, okay, so he's right now, he's 5th in usage rate out of the main guys. So, okay, you can understand that. But you look at his numbers, he is so efficient. And then the one thing you think about is he has played just 99 of his minutes without Tatum. In those minutes, the Celtics have a 7.1 net rating and a 117.2 offensive rating. So that's basically a top 6 offense and a top 14 in net rating. So Jalen, you look at him without Tatum, it's a 3.6 net, which is still fine, but the offensive rating is 112.2, which would be about 18th compared to Derek White, that's top 6. So I think like it feels like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you watch every game too, you're there at most of them. It feels like to me, Derek White is matched up a lot with Tatum. To my point, it's only 99 minutes without Tatum. What I would do more often is let Derek White just run the show when Jason Tatum's not on the court, because Tatum's like lineup proof, whoever you put on the court with Tatum. So I would rather Tatum like stay paired up with Drew and Derek White play with Jalen and Porzingis more, because like one of the developing things is obviously the whole Jalen Porzingis thing. But the numbers with Jalen and Porzingis on the court with no Tatum, it has not been great. But if you throw White in there, White, Jalen, and Porzingis with no Tatum, it's just 47 minutes, but it's a plus 13.4 net. Jalen and Porzingis without Tatum and White, they are being outscored by 18.5 per 100. It's only 33 minutes. But I just feel like it almost still feels like to me that the coaching staff, Joe Mazzulla, maybe they do. I know like the front office does, obviously. I don't think they know how good Derek White is. Like, Derek White is incredibly efficient. He's their best decision maker. Like you mentioned Horford with the passing. The best 2 passers on the team are Derek White and Al Horford. So I do think that they should be running more offense. Like you point out the playmaking with Tatum. It still is not where you'd like it ultimately to be. Well, one way to do that is take the ball out of his hands more often and let Derek White run the show. he to me is the best true point guard on the team in terms of running an offense. I think he's much better of a decision maker than Drew. Like Drew has some turnovers too that make you kind of scratch your head. So that would be my one critique, is just run things through Derek White more.
Yeah, there was a funny play with Drew last night where caught the ball, but it went through his hands, and he still went up and finished like he had in his hands. He does some stuff like that that makes your head spin. But White's got the best pick and roll numbers on the team. He's got the lowest turnover rate. You're 100% right about that. And you've seen in recent games when he gets more opportunity, he makes the most of it. I think from a coaching standpoint, the challenge for them is that he's so low maintenance and so unwilling at times to assert himself just to sacrifice for the other guys, that it can be tough to be pushed in that direction. And luckily, Tatum does it. You hear Tatum a lot saying that he's got to be more aggressive, that he's got to get the ball and do his thing. But you're still managing that Brown thing, because he talked about over the last couple of games, he still wants to be a playmaker. He still wants the ball in his hands, and he wants to develop that side of his game. And you do see the moments where it looks like he might be capable, like that Milwaukee game, but there's just so much more bad than good there. And you hate to pick on him because he gets it, day in and day out, and he's an incredibly important part of this team's offense with how efficient of a scorer he is. But at a certain point, like you mentioned, Tatum, taking a sacrifice there to get White the ball, but the guy who really does have to sacrifice the most to make this work, and fortunately he's stated a willingness to do it, is Jalen. He's got to be off the ball. He's got to be a cutter like he was last night. Got to screen a little bit more to free himself in the lane and really stay in the lane as an offensive player, catching and finishing, because that's his strength, shooting the mid-range shot. He still hasn't shot the three all that well this year. Game in and game out. They got to figure out where he's best positioned on this team, because I think anybody else with the ball in their hands, something decent's going to happen. For Jalen, you're still looking at a guy who's averaging 3.6 assists and 2.4 turnovers a game. And it just doesn't seem like it's ever going to get better. And every player has weaknesses. That's the ball handling, the playmaking. He has a lot of other parts of his game that are great. But in order for him to be consistent and this offense to be consistent, because he's such a big part of it, volume wise, he's got to find that spot where he can contribute night in and night out and still feel good about himself. Because obviously, I think that's a big part of this is, not necessarily managing his ego, but he's a star in this league. He's got to have the touches. He's got to have the ball time. It's part of it. And so I think that's the balancing act for this coaching staff between, having White run lineups and having Brown run lineups is, trying to keep Jalen involved and active, because the other thing for him too is the defense. Like when he's hitting shots, when he's in the flow, you're getting a different Jalen defensively that you need. And then when it's not going his way, he can just be baffling on that end of the floor. So he really
Oh,
is the swing guy on this team.
yeah, it can be infuriating because it's not like when he's focused, to your point, think about the Harden thing last year when he took on that matchup in the postseason. Like he can do it one-on-one every once in a while, but the thing that aggravates you defensively, or me, I should say defensively, how many times is he going to get back cut where he's just falling asleep? Like he doesn't know where his guy is. That's another thing that does slightly aggravate me about this team, as great as they've been. They overhelp a lot. Like there was a play last night where Drew had DeRozan and Banton came over to help him when there was a shooter in the corner. I'm like, do you know who that is? Like, that's Drew Holiday. You don't have to help Drew. Remember, this is the guy that was covering Embiid, and he's covering
They've
Giannis.
done
Like, you
that
know
a
what they?
lot throughout this
Yeah,
schedule, helping with
yeah,
Holiday. It's like, what?
yeah. They overhelp him. Like, what's going on here? So, and then in terms of Jalen, so that's one thing is defensively, but it does feel like if you look at his numbers, they're down last year from, like, we saw a sign of it. Last night he had 8 fast break points, 16 points in the paint, which those are the numbers you want to see from Jalen Brown. Like, you go back to post All-Star break last year, he was 4th in the NBA in points in the paint, and he was 1st in fast break points. Now, the problem with the fast break points is the Celtics don't turn you over at all. That's another thing they don't do. They don't force turnovers. I know they've sort of incorporated the press at times to try to, I don't know if that's trying to force turnovers or trying to just slow down the opponent, whatever it is. I kind of like the idea, but so they don't get out and run as much as you would like to see. And that would certainly favor Jalen. My one concern about the 2-man game with Porzingis is I feel like he's really committed to it now, which that makes me think like, hey, Derek White should be running that. Like, let's give Derek White the ball and like Jalen goes in the corner, or hey, Tatum can run that with Porzingis. Like, I feel like Jalen, since he found this one thing, and he clearly wants to be a better playmaker, I just don't think it's what's best for the team is for him to be sort of running the show as often as we've seen at times this season. But the other element is the 3-point shooting you mentioned. There's no reason that Jalen should be taking as many threes as he is. He's taken 7.2, which is 21st in the NBA. He's 122nd in percentage. That just why? And he's the one guy that I'll say this. And I like Jalen. Like, this is going to come across as like I don't like Jalen, but he's the one guy on this team that I think at times it's just like, hey, I haven't got my shot in a while. I'm going to take a shot on this possession. And you can almost see it, like when it's going to happen. Like, he'll get the ball in the wing and you're like, okay, there's no chance he's passing this ball. he's going to shoot it. So, and I am empathetic because to your point, he does have to make the biggest sacrifice. Like, Tatum's the guy who's not making a sacrifice. There's nobody on the team like Porzingis. So Porzingis is going to get his opportunities. Now, I would argue they should use him even more on offense, but no matter what, he's going to get his opportunities because he's going to be the screener every time he's on the court. So Jalen is kind of the guy that has to make the biggest adjustment.
Absolutely. But overall, it's been good so far. The offense in that top 10 territory through the schedule so far. Defense has been better, I feel like, than a year ago. And now they get this in-season tournament to look ahead to. Just want to give a quick shout out to some of our sponsors here. FanDuel, of course, right now offering $150 in bonus bets when you place a winning $5 money line bet, which can be easy. Just pick the Celtics over the Bulls or something like that, and you're going to get your 150 in bonus bets when you head over to FanDuel.com/Boston. Football rolling along. You'll have a Thursday night game this week as well as all the weekend action, and plenty of NBA going on right now as well. Just head over to FanDuel.com/Boston. Take advantage of that. Official sports wagering partner of CLNS Media. Tickets, big deal right now as well. If you want to go to one of these games, check out SeatGeek. SeatGeek, use the code DreamersPro to get $20 off your first order when you head over there. Celtics tickets real tough right now. A lot of tickets just gone crazy expensive, but SeatGeek always gives you the best deal for tickets, and you can get $20 off your first order right now with that code DreamersPro. And HelloFresh, love HelloFresh. Oop. That's not HelloFresh. There we go. HelloFresh.com/CLNS free. You're going to get free breakfast in your box every week for life as long as you continue to order it. Great options right now, seasonal options, customizable to your diet or preferences. And it all comes to your door fresh. It's America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh.com/CLNS free. So it is going to be the Celtics and the Pacers on Monday. I think it's a good matchup for Boston. The Knicks would have been tricky, and of course the Bucks went well for the Celtics last time around, but more fully formed roster, bigger star on the other side, a team you played recently, which can sometimes be a thing. The Pacers are interesting just because Halliburton didn't play that first game. They ended up being the 50-point win. It's an awful defensive team, just brutal. They'll give up as many points as they score more often than not, and it has been a historic offense here. But it is the kind of team that can give the Celtics some issues in terms of their up and down pace, the amount of threes that they're able to get off, and that dynamic playmaker at the center of it all, trying to figure him out. I feel good about them winning this one. But you do worry, like you said, the crowd going crazy, how much they want this as a team that hasn't even been in the playoffs recently. Those things might give them a little bit more urgency in this game than the Celtics have, especially on the road.
Yeah, and imagine if the Warriors took him #2 overall in the COVID year, Halliburton, or LaMelo. Even, like, I understand Halliburton wasn't going to go #2 based on the draft resume coming in, but they didn't take LaMelo. Instead, they took James Wiseman. It's just he's now on the bench for the Detroit Pistons. But the one thing that does scare you is the offense is incredible. Halliburton shooting in the mid-40s too from three-point territory. He's getting you at least 10 assists per game, and he's doing it with the shooting. That team is obviously playing at his pace. They've gone all offense. Like Buddy Hield, who it felt like at times he had issues with the organization. Now he's all in the starting lineup. They've inserted him into the starting lineup. They just jack up threes. So if this is like a playoff series, a first-round series, you'd say, okay, yeah, they may take a game, but the Celtics are going to win this thing relatively easily because this is one of the worst defensive teams in the NBA. But in a one-off situation, it scares you. The one thing that has me feeling now, obviously the Celtics are clearly the better team. The one thing that has me feeling really optimistic is the way they treated Chicago. They're clearly into it. So I think what's going to happen with this Halliburton matchup, everybody knows that he's going to be hyped up entering the game, and deservingly so. He's their biggest star, and he's a fringy MVP candidate right now. If the Pacers end up with the top 6 seed in the Eastern Conference, he's certainly going to deserve all the credit. But I think these guys, the Derek Whites, the Drew Holidays, to a lesser extent, Jason Tatum when he gets his opportunity, but mainly Holiday and White, I think they're going to be fired up to go against him, right? When it's like, okay, we got to slow this guy down. These are 2 all NBA defenders just to seize it a go. So I think the Celtics are going to win this thing relatively convincingly just because they're going to be all in. If this was just a normal Tuesday night game, or I should say Monday night game, maybe it would be different, right? Like maybe they wouldn't match the energy of Indiana at home, because we know that Indiana would be fired up just because it's the Celtics. They're at home. Indiana's a story right now in the NBA. The Celtics are the favorites to win the NBA championship. They'd be up for it. But in this case, because it's the in-season tournament, I do feel like the Celtics are going to bring the necessary energy to an inferior opponent, which at times over the past 2 years we haven't always seen. Charlotte would be an example of that. They were great in the first half, and then they kind of fell asleep at the wheel. I don't see that happening in this situation. So I think the Celtics, I haven't seen the line on that yet, but I imagine it's going to be something like 8.5 or something, even if it's in Indy. Last night, that game was like 11.5. I took it on an alternate spread, 24.5 plus 330, because I'm like, the Celtics are going to try to run this thing up no matter what they say. And the Bulls, they're going to play their part. So I think the Celtics win this game by double digits, and then we'll get the showdown against Milwaukee and Vegas, which will be awesome. Because I don't think that now Milwaukee could be upset, but I'm not going to bet against Giannis and Lillard when it's Randall on the other side. I mean, at times Randall can't. What is he, south of 40% from the field right now?
Yeah, he's had a rough start for them, with what's been an overall good start for the team. Dominant defense, as you expect from them. He is at 39.5. And I know he's been dealing with injuries at different points and stuff, but 27.5% from 3.
Yeah, he's weird, man. Like every other season is bad for him, and Brunson's having an outstanding season for them. RJ Barrett's actually having a good season for them as well. I would rather, I mean, from a selfish perspective, like you probably say the easier path is to play the Knicks than the Bucks, even though the Knicks have this great defense. From a selfish perspective, I'd rather see them play the Bucks. And I think most people, and even though it's New York, most people want to see that again, right? Like Giannis and Dame versus Tatum and Jalen, and hopefully Porzingis can play in that game. Doesn't look like he's going to play Friday, right? But he could play Monday. I heard him say that on the broadcast last night.
Yeah, he's looking at a week there, and he did shoot around pregame last night, so he's back on the court. Did some lifting yesterday as well, I believe. So he's getting closer. That could be part of the weirdness of that night, though, is integrating him back in. But it's been a bad matchup for Indiana, honestly. Like they've handled everything that's come their way so far this season for the most part. And then on that night, again, no Halliburton, but they're just blown away completely in that game. And then last year there was one bad loss I remember the Celtics had against them, but otherwise they took care of business against this team. Neesmith can't really stay with Brown and Tatum, even though he's had a pretty good year so far. Not a lot of perimeter defenders on that side. Miles Turner's good rim protector, but I don't see them winning either. The line is, had it right in front of me, 5. So Celtics come in as
5.
5-point favorites. Knicks
Whoa.
6-point underdogs at the Bucks.
That's kind of crazy to me that it's only a 5-point line.
I'm surprised too.
Like the money's going to come in, and I get it's home court and all that, but I bet the money's going to come in heavy on the Celtics. I watched a good portion of that. I had on one of the other screens that Atlanta Indy game. Like, did you see that? Like, it was like
The
the
150
over-under.
games, right?
Yeah, like that was insane. Like, no, both teams are just like, you know what? We're not going to play any defense. You want to take a 3? Go ahead and take a 3. So, I mean,
And they're not this dominant home team either. They're 6-5 at home.
And they don't really have anybody that you're scared of after Halliburton. Like Buddy Hield can heat up. Miles Turner, I mean, he's basically their only good defensive player, and he's going to do everything for that team. And his 3-point shooting has never been consistent. He'll have years where it's really good, and then he'll have years where it's like 32 or 31%. So nobody else really scares you on that team. I do want, like, I wonder if they come up with any interesting strategies for that game that they wouldn't ordinarily use. Like, and I know Gio talked about process last night, but do they put more emphasis into the scouting report in this game, sort of like a play, not to the extent of a playoff series, but like 65% of the prep you do for a playoff series for this one game against Indiana? That would be interesting to me. Like, if we see them, and not that this would be something unique, but are they blitzing Halliburton just to get the ball out of his hands? He does move well without the ball too. Like, the guy's an outstanding player.
Yeah, I don't know how you handle that. And they're not a team that's done that a ton. Like they're usually going to drop back and give up the mid range, especially if Porzingis is in there. But like you said, they've pressed. They've done a lot of interesting stuff defensively this year, which I've been thrilled about. Most pleasant surprises how versatile and dominant at times they've been defensively. Really capped by that opening night win against the Knicks. It still excites me about the defensive possibilities with Porzingis here. So it's going to be interesting. Over-under is 235, of course.
Yeah, Pacers game.
Yeah, so they got fortunate here. I mean, if they're at the Knicks, and they could have been, as I mentioned, just because of the point differential, I guess the wild card wasn't automatically at the bottom. I guess that would have been really tough going to New York. That's been one of the tougher matchups for the Celtics over the last couple of years here. And then we'll see what happens on that side. And it will obviously be in Vegas, which I'm really excited about. I'm going to be heading out there. We'll have coverage if the
Nice.
Celtics move on from the first in-season tournament out there in Vegas. A lot of other good games, too. Suns-Lakers is interesting. Lakers starters 2-point favorites. Kings 5 over the Pelicans. And that's it. You got your 8 teams right there. So we'll be watching it all. Brian going to podcast about it over at Off the Pike over on the Ringer Podcast Network. Always great talking to you, Brian. Following along on Twitter for all the different stats, lineups, and observations. He throws out over there. Great Celtics follow, as well as the Pats, which I don't know how you've done it this year anyway with content for them. We're doing it over here too somehow. We hired a guy, Taylor Kyles, who first year on the beat, this is what he's up against, which isn't fun.
It's horrible, man. It really is. Like, I actually said this on my pod after the loss to the Giants. I said, this is the biggest result the Patriots have had since they won the Super Bowl against the Rams after the 2018 season, because this basically, you're getting a top 3 pick unless somehow you upset the Chargers, which I don't envision seeing that happening.
Looks
Because
like
the Patriots,
Zappy's going to start. That doesn't make you feel great.
yeah, well, he's probably slightly better than Mac right now, but still, we saw his ability to tank
Like this
against
much.
against the Giants. We saw his ability to tank, so I think he can certainly do that. But I even said, like, they're wearing the Patriot uniforms, like the red ones. I
Oh,
tweeted
yeah,
out,
you're very mad about this.
yeah, it's like, don't wear those uniforms when your team's so bad. And like, people are tweeting at me like they were terrible then. Like, this is fitting. I'm like, no, but the uniform's too good. I hate the Patriots all navy uniforms. I don't know how you feel about those. They turn the color rush uniforms into their regular uniforms, which I despise those. So I feel like if you're going to wear a throwback, even if the team wasn't great in the throwback, they did go to the Super Bowl in '85. But even if they weren't great in the throwback, you only wear the throwback when you're good. You don't wear that type of throwback, which is an awesome uniform, when you're in the middle of a tank and you're 2-9 and you've been outscored by more than 100 points this season. I just don't think you should be celebrating the great uniforms. That's my point. It's not the fact that they stunk in those uniforms so they should keep wearing them. It's the fact that those uniforms are good. Save them for when you're good again.
What do you think they should do this offseason with the draft, with the coach, with the quarterback?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that they're drafting either Drake May or Caleb Williams. I'm all in on Drake. Like, obviously, I'd take Caleb Williams too, but I feel like he's going to go number 1. I don't think the Patriots can get up to number 1 because Carolina is such a dumpster fire with Bryce Young at quarterback, who they traded up to get Bryce Young. CJ Stroud went after him, and CJ Stroud is significantly better than him. And now the Panthers don't have the number 1 pick, and it's going to the Bears because they traded for Bryce Young, who's the inferior quarterback to CJ Stroud. So I do feel like Carolina is going to get that number 1 pick, which goes to the Bears. And I'd be shocked if they don't take Caleb Williams. But I think the Pats are going to be in range at that either 2 or 3 spot. Arizona would have to lose another game. They have like one winnable game left on their schedule, but I think they'll take a quarterback. I don't see any other way around it. In terms of Bill, at this point, I'd be surprised if he's back. I really would, just because all the noise is there. We're now, 4 years removed from Tom. and it's getting worse. If you look at his stretch here, the past 4 seasons without Tom, his winning percentage without Tom the past 4 seasons is worse than Joe Philbin's coaching record. Like Joe, like that, those type of coaches, that's how bad it's been. And I can't believe that it fell off this poorly, but it's more about roster management than anything else. Like, I mean, look at his 2022 draft. There's nobody, like, the only guys left are what? Cole Strange, who's like 37 right now. They took an old guard in the first round. So a non-premium position in the first round with a guy that's old, and he hasn't even been that good when he's been on the field. Tyquan Thornton in the second round of that draft. I mean, it's just been a dumpster fire. I mean, Marcus Jones is a guy that is a return guy, really. He's injured for the season. And these running backs they took, you got nothing out of those guys. So it's just, and Jack Jones you had to get rid of after you
I
stuck
was
by
just
him
gonna
with the
say
whole,
you dumped Jack
yeah.
Jones.
So no, they're a mess, and I feel like it's, we'll see. It's going to be interesting. I wonder if the Chargers job will be appealing to Bill if they move on from Bill, because at least they have like a ready-made quarterback there. And the Chargers may be the one team that's like, hey, we need somewhat of a splash of a hire. Belichick would certainly be a splash. I don't know how good he's 71. Like, I say the Chargers, but I heard all this stuff, or you've seen all this stuff about the Commanders. Like, why would they want Bill? They're not in a position where they're competing now. Like, if you're a rebuilding
No,
team,
they're just old.
yeah, and we've seen Bill with a rebuilding team. It hasn't been good. Like, why would you want to rebuild with Bill? The only thing that you would sell yourself on is, hey, is he still an elite coach? Which at this point, I don't really think he is. But if you think he's still an elite coach, then you put him on a team that's ready to compete. I don't see Washington being that team. And ordinarily, it's not good teams that are hiring coaches.
Yeah, it'd be Dallas, right? That would be the one.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But would he work for Jerry? Now, that would be drama because, like, that's Kraft's arrival as a
Yeah.
GM, right? Like, those are the two biggest owners right now in the sport. But I just can't see him working for Jerry after what happened with Jimmy Johnson. I know Jimmy Johnson's going into the Ring of Fame, but they had their issues. He had his issues with Bill Parcells. I just don't see him getting along with Jerry Jones.
Well, we'll see what happens there. I'm glad I don't cover them. Brian Barrett does over at the Off the Pike podcast and all of the Boston sports happenings. So we'll save the Red Sox for another day.
Yeah.
Great to have you here, Brian. We'll talk to you again soon, and enjoy the rest of the Celtics season as it continues here, the in-season tournament as well.
Thanks for having me, Bobby.